South Carolina is currently in a very interesting and relatively new position. Look, they almost lost last night against Louisville. And this isn't a pulling the fire alarm or we're sounding emergency sirens or anything like that. That's not what this video is about. This video is a checkpoint because they did almost lose last night to Louisville. This would have been their first back-to-back losses in years, obviously after the loss to Texas in Las Vegas, which I was there for in person and got to see that game there live. I want to take a moment and just kind of think, where do I feel South Carolina is right now? And I think if you go person to person, you ask their opinion to answer that question, this is very subjective. And I think that there's a big reason why. Because I think that there's two ways you can really look at South Carolina because of the standard that they have set as a program and how good that they have been. You can look at this South Carolina team in comparison to the teams that are surrounding them right now and where they stand in terms of the landscape of this season and against other national title contenders, which they are. Let me make that very clear. South Carolina is obviously still a national title contender. But if you try and compare them to past South Carolina teams, whether it's the team that goes undefeated, it's Aaliyah Boston's national championship team, whoever. If you go and look at those teams that have won titles, I think you're going to see this team come up a little bit short in terms of being able to reach the dominance that you saw with those teams. And I think it's important to make sure that we aren't doing that with this South Carolina team because we have grown so accustomed to the incredibly high standard of dominance. And when I mean dominance from South Carolina as a program, especially in recent years. And to see this team have a little bit of struggles and to not look and maybe not look for sure, but also feel like the true dominant force of South Carolina in the past and have it be, even if you're still winning games, doing so in a different way. It's important to make sure that we're not, counting this team out per se. And not to say that I've really seen that, but I just, it's so odd, frankly, to even see South Carolina in a position of possibly losing back-to-back games because it just has not been something that we've seen. So let's dive into this and where it stands now because, again, this team is still absolutely a Final Four contender and should have the hopes and aspirations of going and winning a national championship. I don't think that there's any doubt in my mind that they have the potential to go and do that. But what are the things missing right now that maybe kind of leaves it from the South Carolina side? If you're looking at it from that program perspective, what is the difference between maybe some of those older teams and this team here? I think when you look at it, the very first thing that comes to mind for me is depth. And a lot of that is out of South Carolina's control. Obviously, we know how important Chloe Kitts and Ashlyn Watkins not being available for this season is for this South Carolina team. But when you look at some of these past teams, it was a incredibly frustrating task to try and beat South Carolina because whenever those starters subbed out, you had 5 stars and just absolute incredible players coming in. And I don't feel like we felt that impact all in this year of that depth in that way where you just had death lineup after death lineup coming at you and there was nothing you could do about it because South Carolina's bench could go and be a contender on their own. I don't have that feeling this year. And again, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that you lose 2 starters, right? You lose Chloe Kitts, you lose Ashlyn Watkins, and that has completely changed the rotations and who has responsibilities and what you're looking at, and just also the flexibility, right? With this South Carolina team, it's completely different, and it's felt, I feel like, in a lot of ways. And again, so now I feel like when these games go into the depths, right? Like maybe there would be times like in that Louisville game, especially because the Texas game, that was 2 really good teams battling out, right? I'm looking more at this Louisville game and in terms of in games in years past, right? Like to me, this wouldn't be a game that Louisville would be able to keep up in not that Louisville is a bad team by any means, but to me, this was where you felt the depth missing, where you just didn't have that to kind of run away with this game in that way. And it feels like that might be the biggest difference here in terms of the dominance because you had 40 minutes of pure dominance with that. But I also think that, and this is especially with Ashlyn Watkins not being available this year, the defense doesn't feel as look. When I think about defense, I think about the best defenses have two things, right? And it can be kind of a mixture. It doesn't have to be, it can almost be one or the other at times as well. You either are the attacker on defense, because defensive just plays in general can be very reactive. And South Carolina has always been very, very good at not being reactive on defense. They are going and making the play on defense. You see that with Texas right now. We saw that like in the UCLA game, for example. Like the best defenses attack you on defense because they have that much confidence in their defense. But the one thing that South Carolina has also always had, when you look at their most successful teams, is ridiculous rim protection. And look, Ladina Okoth, Joyce Edwards, they have been productive. They have been good. They don't have that same almost fear factor, right, of an Aaliyah Boston or Camila Cardoso or obviously an Asia Wilson, right? Those type of players, and that's where Ashton Watkins would have been a major piece here for South Carolina. You don't have that on this team in that way. Like there was a couple drives where like whether there was no help side or again just where that normal like fear essentially of driving to the lane against South Carolina didn't exist for Louisville. And I thought that was so jarring almost to see in that way. And it feels like it is something that I don't know if you can directly fix this year because again, depth and who you're missing on defense is not at the fault of South Carolina or Dawn Staley's coaching or anything of that nature. It's just the reality of the situation. And if that intensity on defense translated over the course of these games in the past years for South Carolina, and I think there were at times where like I didn't feel the intensity as well from South Carolina in this Louisville game. Certainly you go and do enough. They shut it down there at the end, had the wide open three for Louisville, but a lot of those possessions towards the end, South Carolina did what they needed to do on defense. So again, these are all in comparisons to the standards of past ridiculous success from South Carolina, but I can't help but have that feeling that that's where some of the dominance is missing. But what does this team have that maybe past teams don't? And this is something I've talked about before, something I'm sure I'm going to talk about again. This team has a player in Tania Latson that is not only a scorer, can play defense as well, by the way, but notably because South Carolina's had scores, but Tania Latson is stamped. Tania Latson is stamped that in a way that no scorer that's transferred into South Carolina has ever been stamped before. This is a player that's led the NCAA. I mean, she's been at the top of the scoring rankings like every year she's been active in the NCAA. And it's different. Obviously, it's different being at South Carolina than being at Florida State for a numerous amount of reasons, but mostly because you have a lot more players that can go and score the ball. We saw it with like a Tessa Johnson, right? We've seen it with Joyce Edwards. Like, I mean, there's so many players that can go get a bucket, right? But at the end of the first half of that Louisville game, Tania Latson had the least amount of shot attempts from all the starters. And it's not that simple to just break it down like that. But even in that Texas game as well, I don't want to see Tania Latson have to kind of grow into these games. I want Tania Latson to take it from the jump and go. And it hasn't been easy for her to do that. And it hasn't been as seamless as I had kind of hoped it to be. I talked about it because I voted her for my SEC Player of the Year. And what I had thought kind of in my head, my thought process, because obviously there was so much discourse with Mylasia Fulwiley and like the freedom versus the responsibility that she had and on things of all that nature. And one thing with Dawn Staley, and I've said this before, she evolves, right? You lose to Iowa in the Final Four, you go find 3-point shooting, you go and win the national championship, right? Like that was how that process went. Last year, they needed offense. You go and get Tania Latson. And we haven't felt Tania Latson in that same way. And it's not going to be exactly the same, but I haven't felt like we've seen like, oh, there's the scorer. Like that bucket right there, that's Tania Latson. And I want to see her be able to just kind of get into a game and go. And there's a healthy balance with that. You don't want to just be like complete, Florida State, right? Where she's the system. That's it pretty much. But you also don't want to be so far deep into the system of South Carolina when you have a player like this in Tania Latson where you don't let her go and be herself. And I think that this is, we're not at either one of those ends right now. I just want us to be a little bit closer to the Florida State side of that and find that happy medium and be able to get Tania Latson involved. Because again, you go and get the score for a reason. And it hasn't felt like she's been able to fully get comfortable in that while also showing her ability to do other things like defense and playmaking, so on and so forth. There's been good things. It's not to say that Latson has been bad. I just want to see Tania Latson be Tania Latson. And I don't know if we've fully gotten to experience that yet since she's at South Carolina. But those are the three things that come to mind. Because again, if you're comparing this team to past South Carolina dominance, those are the type of things that come to mind. The depth and the defense are different in a way that they don't have this in the way that was so dominant for past South Carolina teams. But you also have a player in Tania Latson that you haven't really had on South Carolina teams in the past either, that you can find a new way to dominate with. And so to compare it to those past teams, it's different, right? And when you look at where they've been at this point in the year in past seasons, when you look at this from a national perspective, to me right now, UConn and Texas are in a tier of their own. They're the tippy top tier, right? South Carolina is directly below that. And can the South Carolina team still win the SEC? Absolutely. Can the South Carolina team still make it to the Final Four? Absolutely. Can they even win a national championship? I think they absolutely can. There has to be, I think, a little bit more fluidity found. I think there has to be a bit more defensive intensity found in order to do that. And I'm very excited to see how this team grows because, again, it's just different. It's not bad. It's not to say that South Carolina is a bad team right now. I'm not saying that in the slightest. What's different is where they are maybe in their stages of growth this season in comparison to some of these other ones. Because it's a very different lineup. You have injuries. You have a new player in Tania Latson that you're trying to integrate in this way. And I'm very excited to see what this South Carolina team looks like by the time we get to the SEC tournament. Do we find that level of dominance? Do they find a different way to dominate in that way? I can't wait to see it because it's a new challenge. It's a new way for South Carolina to try and play basketball while also keeping the things that are tried and true and made them dominant in the past. So I'm very excited to see this, and I'm not pulling any fire alarms by any means. So don't want anyone thinking that in the comments or nothing. There's no emergency sirens going off. I am just genuinely very interested in the story of South Carolina this season and seeing where they're at right now on the back of being able to kind of escape the SEC ACC challenge with that win after Louisville's not able to knock down the open three at the very, very end. We're playing what ifs, but ultimately the sky would be falling for the discourse if that shot goes in. I wouldn't be there. I'm interested while still confident in where South Carolina is going to be. But what do you think? How are you rating South Carolina where they stand right now? Do you think that they can find the dominance of past teams, or what is the difference maybe in this team to find a new way to dominate? Let me know down below in the comment section. Make sure you're tapped in here on No Cap Space. Of course, here on the YouTube, you can subscribe to make sure you're notified every time we go live or we have an upload. Of course, also NoCapSpaceWBB.com for all of our print and podcast content, along with all of our socials. You can find everything down below in the description. Until next time, I'll talk to you very soon.